So is this the end of the academic research system as we know it, at least here in the United States? That's the question I'm going to delve into a little bit here. But first, before we dive in, I really appreciate you being here. I really appreciate you being a subscriber, being here on my channel, spending time here, considering your research career, your grants, other things associated with that. If you can do me a favor of liking this video, subscribing to this video, even hyping this video, it really, really helps a lot. Helps me keep doing this work that I do and supporting you in your research career. So let's dive into that question. Is it the end of these careers as we know it? I think it certainly feels like that for a lot of people. So many people that I talk to and work with, it just feels like, what do I do now? I saw a statistic. I don't know how accurate it is. I didn't dive into the details of who provided the statistic, but the statistic that 57% of researchers in academia and academia sort of associated world are considering leaving, are considering alternative career paths. And I get that. I'm somebody who was a tenured researcher at UNC Chapel Hill. I gave that tenure up. I left. It was long before the current stuff that's happening now in the United States. But I left, and it was hard. It was really hard. And I know all of the, well, I shouldn't say I know your considerations, but I know that my considerations, my deliberations on that were very hard. It was tough thinking about how I had built up this whole identity around being a researcher, and that ultimately leaving that, really, it left me disoriented for years afterwards. It took years to sort of get back to a new sense of self, a new sense of who I am in the world without that clear identity of the researcher. And so I can't tell you what's going to happen in the system. I have my guesses, and I'll share most of that in other videos. My guess is that even once this current political moment passes, that we probably won't get back to what we had before in the United States. We probably will have some kind of research going on still, but it might be at a reduced scope or scale. And who knows exactly what that looks like. That's my best guess, but I'll share more about that separately. Here, I want to talk about you and your situation and what to do about this feeling of like, it's all collapsing, and what can I do? What should I do? Should I actually leave? Should I get the hell out of here, go find something else to do? And again, I've gone down that road. So the first thing I'll say to that, just the first general piece of advice I have is don't be hasty. I'm actually reading a fiction series called The Wheel of Time right now. And there's this group of people, the Ogiers in The Wheel of Time, who are very large, almost giant-like people. And they are very slow moving. They have this saying of don't be hasty. They use that frequently. And I love that saying because most of my hasty decisions, I mean, in the end worked out, like me leaving my faculty job. It was both slow brewing, but then at the moment that it happened, it was kind of hasty because I hadn't actually fully decided whether to leave or not until an event happened that just triggered my anger and my frustration with the whole thing. And then I sent that resignation notice very reactively, very hastily. And then it was difficult. Like it was not an easy departure. It was just a very rocky ride having resigned like that. So that's the first thing that I would suggest to anybody considering this is don't be hasty. And I think most researchers are careful and cautious by nature. And so I would also say, don't be overly cautious about it. But I want to go into something that you can do now, an exploration that you can take in this time that I wish I had had more sense of at the time. Like at the time, I knew in general what Freud's theories were, and especially Freud's idea of a, quote, ego. And since that time, and stick with me, I'm going somewhere with this. Since that time, I have learned so much about that concept of an ego. I've learned a lot about it from sort of a higher, like a consciousness perspective or whatever personal development perspective, that it's not as simple as we might think culturally, just referring briefly or simply to Freud's work on this as like, oh, the ego is bad, and when you have an ego, that means you're being, egotistical essentially. So in some spiritual practices, there's this idea of like, just get rid of your ego altogether. And I kind of call BS on that. And I think that is actually what you're dealing with when you are facing a challenge like this, when you're facing when it all seems like it's crumbling around you and you're like, what do I do? Who am I? What is my identity? Like, especially if I leave or even if I stay, like what do I do? How do I reorient myself? And all of these questions have to do with this ego thing. The ego, how I've learned and grown to define it, is that it's really our interface between our deeper subconscious and you could say consciousness and then the outside world. It's that interface between the two. It's that part of us that is the learned part that protects us, that guards us, that presents that image of who we are. And so the ego is a heavily programmed portion of our consciousness. And it can be programmed in ways, it can end up programmed. I'm not saying somebody is doing the programming, although if you belong to a cult or if you're part of even large institutions, often like academic science, there can be some ego programming there that comes from the outside. But a lot of the ego programming is also just from our own experience in life as we grow up and the conclusions that we make from that experience. But the interesting thing is that a lot of the ego that most of us carry into adulthood and are using in adulthood actually gets formed and solidified in our juvenile years as a teenager. We sort of get certain beliefs about the world and about how things are based upon our experiences and how we're treated as teenagers. So for me, in high school, for example, I was an outsider. I wasn't part of the popular club. I wasn't, I was kind of like on the fringes always, and I was kind of awkward. In my first few years, I was overweight. I felt really just lacking confidence about who I was at the time. So I was also bullied. So my experience was being an outsider, being bullied, being, pushed around. And then, at some point in my high school years, I had a moment where when I was being bullied, where a switch flipped in my mind and I was like, no more. So then I actually picked up like a big wooden board that was lying around for some high school construction and chased some bullies with it. And after that, I didn't get bullied anymore because I was willing to aggressively stand up to bullies after that. And I have been ever since. But even that got programmed in and wasn't necessarily a positive thing, because then in my adult life, whenever I felt like I was being bullied a little bit, I would like aggressively overreact because my ego had learned that this is the way you react to anybody who is doing anything that feels like bullying. You aggressively overreact to them. You aggressively hit back or push back. I mean, I didn't actually hit the people with the board in high school, or I would have gotten in a lot of trouble. but I was ready to. And so our ego learns these things, and then we often bring it into our adult life. And this has to do with this feeling like it's all falling apart, is that many of us face times in our lives where everything that our ego thought it knew about how to be safe, how to protect us, it starts falling apart around us for some reason. Now, sometimes this looks like a midlife crisis. Sometimes this is a systemic crisis, like the current moment that many researchers are in. For me, it was that just crisis of not feeling like I belonged in the system of research, and was just very frustrated by some of the systemic issues and some of my own imposter syndrome, sort of working with those systemic issues at the time. And this, when your ego starts deflating, when your ego starts flattening in that way, that ego that you developed as, let's say, a teenager and or young adult, it feels like the world is ending. It is highly anxiety producing. Your ego suddenly doesn't know how to protect you anymore, because the old ways that it relied upon to do things, to seemingly protect you, like me always striking back at the bullies, it stops working. It doesn't happen anymore. So this specifically is true, like if you're part of a system like academia, and then you get used to operating by the rules of that system, and your ego gets accustomed to that. Like if I present myself in this way, and if I do this kind of research, and if I write grants like this, and if I talk to my colleagues and work this hard, then that seems to keep me safe. That seems to keep me functioning within the system. And your ego learns that stuff and then wants to defend that notion of, quote, safety at all costs, because that is a fundamental evolutionary mechanism that developed to help us survive in whatever environment that we go into as humans. But the problem is that sometimes environments change. Often environments change. This is why even if we don't have systemic collapse, people go through, so many things like midlife crises and other random assorted, health crises and other things, which, I'm not saying that all health crises are caused by ego crises. I'm not making that claim, but I am making the claim that I have observed that there are cases where a health crisis can sometimes show up as it is actually a product or related to an ego crisis, and that if we solve the ego crisis, that sometimes the health crisis lessens in its severity. Again, I'm not prescribing that as a treatment for disease, so please don't confuse what I'm saying in that way or misuse it. The current environment is just so fraught with people being anxious about anything that is said. I just have to be careful here. So in any case, the ego feeling like it no longer can function in the way that it learned is an ego flattening or ego deflation. And that moment is an opportunity. That moment when when you're facing that, and I think it's happening en masse in academia, and that's why there's so much anxiety and worry and thoughts of like, do I leave or do I not leave? Those thoughts are looking at externalities, like, is it going to be better out there than it is in here? Rather than looking at the internal process first, and then starting with that internal process and then moving towards externalities. I wish I had done that when I left my faculty job. I wish I had dealt with sort of the ego stuff first, and then if that led me to the decision to leave, then going ahead and leaving, but being really clear on why I was leaving and more clear on where I was going. I mean, we can't be crystal clear about the future. It's too hard, but we can at least have an idea of, I'm going to head in that direction because I think this would be really an upgrade for me, or a fun and interesting direction to go, or whatever, instead of just reactively leaving because like, this is falling apart, this is no longer working, I better jump ship and do something else. And when we do that reactively, we don't fix the fundamental ego problems that we had, that that we're having. And so we end up in a new situation very anxious. And I have experience here. After I jumped ship from UNC Chapel Hill and into my own business, also with a part-time position at Boise State University, I was constantly in anxiety and panic about how I was going to make the business work along with my job at Boise State. There was a lot of panic, a lot of anxiety, a lot of worries about money and paying the bills, and it just continued for years in my life until I started addressing these ego issues, until I started looking at, like, my ego no longer knows how to survive in its original environment. And so now I'm just like disoriented. I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm trying to go back to the old way, but I can't. And so I'm trying to find mentors that will teach me exactly how to do this new thing. Mentors can be good and positive, but if you over rely on that and think they're going to tell you what to do and how to fix it, like I thought when I started my business, they won't do that for you, because it's fundamentally an issue of your ego no longer knows how to keep you safe anymore. So one of the things that the opportunities, I know I said this earlier and then went off on a tangent, as I often do, but one of the opportunities is that when your ego starts to deflate, when it hits that wall and can no longer operate as it has before because things are crumbling around you in some way, that is the opportunity to upgrade the ego. So I liken it to like software upgrades. I mean, we literally, in our ego, that ego we developed when we were younger, young adults and stuff, that's like an ego 1.0. That's like the 1.0 version of our ego software. And many of us go throughout life until we have a crisis. And then some of us, when the ego deflation or flattening happens during that crisis, we find a path, find a way to upgrade the ego, to intentionally acquire some new programming and develop intentionally an ego 2.0, like, which, for comparison, like 2.0 versus 1.0, a 2.0 ego is more about having some kind of vision or intention of where you're going in life and focusing on that much more and focusing much less on comparing yourself to others, competing just because you feel like you need to keep up. I'm not saying you shouldn't compete intentionally, like if you like sports competitions or card games or whatever kind of competitions, you can keep doing those for fun. But I'm talking about just fundamental, like, this is a dog-eat-dog career or world, and I've got to compete even to survive. That's ego 1.0. Ego 2.0 is focused on aspiration, inspiration, goals, like, and just really focused towards that and not worried about how others are doing or comparing yourself or pushing other people down or needing to get all of the resources or all of the stuff so you can feel safe. That's definitely like an ego 1.0 thing. Like, we see so many leaders around the world who are totally operating from that ego 1.0. Their egos never grew up, and they just, in order to feel safe and secure, they need all the money, all the power, all the adulation, all the recognition. They need everything. And even when they get it all, their ego 1.0 is not going to feel good enough, because there's never enough for ego 1.0. Whereas ego 2.0 is more seeing life as a learning, a great, inspiring, interesting learning journey. Now, in my paradigm, there are like ego 3.0 and even 4.0. I'm not going to get into those here today. But just understanding this framework can be really powerful when you're going through something like a systemic collapse around you, because that induces ego collapse. And if you don't understand that, it can be so panic inducing, it can be so anxiety inducing, and you can feel like really like the world is literally ending for you or potentially ending in the near future. It can be, it can just throw you off. But if you start working with the ego and learning how you can start updating its programming, that allows you to, adopting new beliefs, or I like to call them boxes of logic, starting to adopt those new beliefs, a new perspective of your place in the world and how to, quote, be safe, because that's ultimately what your ego is trying to do, is keep you safe and functional in the world. So how do you upgrade that programming? Well, how you upgrade it is really through practice. It's through learning about what your current, the fundamental beliefs that your current ego adopts as its, quote, reality. And first, understanding that what you thought, what your ego thought as, quote, reality or, quote, truth, was actually just beliefs, that programming that it adopted at some point along the way. And so it's going through this inventory and really examining, like, are those things true? One of the most powerful things that you can bring to this examination is curiosity. Curiosity is such a, genuine curiosity is such a powerful feeling. It's such a powerful tool also in self-examination and in so much else. Like when we're feeling down, when we can get into that mode of curiosity and just say, well, why am I feeling down? That in and of itself can sometimes raise our feeling or our feeling tone. So I can't provide to you a solution to this crazy stuff that's going on in the system today. But what I can say is if you're willing to go on a journey of really trying to assess what's there in Ego 1.0, how is that interacting with, how are the beliefs that I have, the programming that I have there interacting with the collapse or the brokenness that I see around me, and triggering that and raising my anxiety, and what new beliefs, programming would I rather have instead? And really starting thinking about that and being curious about that and saying, do I really need that old programming anymore? So few people actually do this exercise. Like especially like in research and academia, which is kind of funny because we're very intellectual people, the people who are attracted to that, very heady in many ways. And yet this kind of self-examination so rarely takes place in that context. And yet that is one of the big problems in the system today, is that there are a lot of people who, because of the lack of that self-examination, are in some ways dysfunctional, to put it nicely. And dysfunctional people create dysfunctional systems, and then the dysfunctional systems feed back on creating more dysfunctional people. And it's this never-ending feedback loop. And while you may not be able to immediately fix the dysfunctional system, I'll tell you, if you work on the dysfunction of the self, it has profound impact on your ability, whether you leave the job and go into somewhere new, you go in with updated programming, or at least with the notion that that's what you're going to work on, rather than just reacting the same ways you always have to stuff, much like I did. I mean, I jumped ship from my frustrations with academia and then just brought those same frustrations and problems into my work at both Boise State and in the business. It's better if you start working on that stuff now, whether you jump ship or whether through reworking your programming, your wiring, upgrading your ego, you could actually enjoy your position, your career, even if things really change in that career, even if you don't have the status or the funding that you did in the past, maybe you find in that upgrade that you don't need all that stuff, that stuff wasn't that important to you to begin with. It was just ego programming that said, I had to go for that stuff. I had to do that stuff because that's how I thought I needed to survive in the system. But if very few people are getting funded in the system anymore, that's not really a survival tool anymore. I mean, maybe it is for the few people who get funding, but there are a lot who may not get funding. Wouldn't it be better to be able to be highly functional and very positive and inspired, even if that's the case where funding is incredibly difficult to get, so that when funding does come along, it's more likely to land with you, not because you did some extra special like trickery or something, but because you're more positive, you're more focused, you've got a vision of your science, and you have some really good stuff going on as a result of that, such that the funding is more likely to land there and help you boost that science, because people are attracted to that. When you have really good stuff going on, they're more likely to want to support you. So Ego 2.0, in case I created this impression, is not about aspiring for less. It's actually in some cases aspiring for more, but more that's truly aligned with what you care about, your deeper values. And I want to make a whole separate video on that, because that's a whole other ball of wax there. The conditioned values versus the core values, as I call them. So I'll wrap this one up and just really say, if it feels like the system is collapsing around you, this is an opportunity that you have, that you can take or not take. You can take it and do this self-examination and say, really, is my feeling that things are collapsing? Is that my ego, to some extent at least, my ego deflating? Yes, there might be things actually happening in the outside world, but we're talking about the personal reaction to that, how we react, how we manage. And if we're in distraction, avoidance, putting the head in the sand, just working even harder, then we know Ego 1.0 is in full force. If we're still able to be positive and inspired and saying, I'm going to figure it out, whether I need to leave or whether I stay here, I'm going to figure it out and make something work. And I've got a good vision of what that could be. I don't know if I can make it happen or not. Then you're probably more towards the Ego 2.0 territory, and that's good news, but you could further solidify that. So I'll end there. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here with me. And I hope this has helped you. I really do, because this is the kind of thing I so much wish I had when I was facing some more personal challenges. They weren't as much systemic, although some. I wish I'd had these tools. So I wanted to share that with you. And again, if you haven't already done it, please please subscribe. I'd love to hear your comments and experiences with this. I will check them, will answer them. And until next time, this is Morgan. I'll see you later.